So this marks part 3 of my commentary on Proverbs chapter 18. I believe I left off at verse 17. So I'll continue now with verse 18. The lot causeth contentions to cease, and parteth between the mighty. Now I say this sort of thing often, that when I read a verse, especially when I start something new, either a new day or a new episode, and I read something that seems simple on its surface, I'm always reminded that the Proverbs are a direction. They are a finger that is pointing. And it is up to us to see the direction that the verse is pointing us in. In many cases, it is pointing us towards a blank canvas. Now, this blank canvas is not nothing. It is not arbitrary. It is pointing us to illustrate upon it. But this finger that points is much more than just to that of the canvas. It is upon the canvas and through the canvas, through our experimentation, through our participation, and our creativity, that we can uncover the message that is being said to us. And by extension, we would do a great disservice to recognize that there is a superficiality. For if we stay upon the surface, we risk not understanding or not attempting to dig deeper. And not always will we find something beneath. But more times than not, I am surprised by what unfolds upon that canvas, given the opportunity to do so. And what emerges is something I had not expected. The finger has pointed me in a direction that I had not seen at the outset. But it is not until I participated and I put forth the effort and attention that that space was illuminated to me. So let's begin, as we usually do, by splitting this verse into two parts. The first, the lot causeth contentions to cease. Now, what does it mean, this lot? Well, we can think of it as a decision that is made by random selection. We could think of it as a person's luck or condition in life that is determined by something that is beyond. The definition I see before me says, determined by fate or destiny. Now, there are other definitions of the word lot, but I think that these two are the ones that we are going to work with. Now, we spent some time, not a short amount of time, last episode talking about causes, talking about first causes. That was verse 17. He that is first in his own cause seems just, but his neighbor comes and searches him. Now, my exploration into that verse was quite detailed, perhaps. And I'm not going to recreate that experience here, but I think that if anything is to be said of this cause, it is that it is at the root, the foundation of something, the beginning of something. Perhaps the beginning of a cycle. I had mentioned last time the difference between an image and a series of images that are compacted together. In this way, it forms sort of a video that we can see. Both paths are representations that we can observe and that we could take in information. Of course, the one with multiple images provides us with more information, with more context, whereas the still image, less so. But we are afforded a greater relationship with that image and all of the components as they were at that moment. And so the lot here is the beginning. It is the cause of the cessation of contention. And I have to wonder, what is it about this lot, this potential random decision making, that might cause some heated disagreement to stop? Well, just thinking of the early Israelites, perhaps even in their experience out of Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, that community of people must have been held together in some sense very tightly. Perhaps in cases of profound testing, perhaps it seemed that they weren't tight at all. Perhaps there was much wavering. Perhaps there was desire to go back to Egypt, return to their state of slavery. In fact, we know this to be true from those early books. But what is it about our decisions, about their decisions, that causes contention? I think of the position of leadership in which the ancient Israelites must have been anxious to choose somebody that would bring them to the promised land, that would lead them towards a better way of life. Certainly when the state was established, that question, that problem, that desire had not gone away. And certainly in the modern day, despite the Industrial Revolution and all of the material wonders that it has brought us, that it has afforded us, we still desire strong leadership. Outside of leadership, though, in cases of choice, either fortune or doom, generally the circumstances of life, it's interesting to reflect on the open nature of it all. That something is determined outside of us. Now, before I progress, I think that case of leadership is important. And the reflection on the early Israelites is also important. Because the leadership that is chosen by Lot was not something that was uncommon in that day. And I would have to imagine that if we extended that to modern day America in 2023, what exactly that would look like. And I would have to imagine that it probably wouldn't look very well. There would be many situations, many circumstances in which an individual that has been chosen by Lot would not be able to live up to the responsibility or the requirements therein. I think of how massive our society is compared to that old ancient Israel experience, ancient Israelite experience. How many more variables are involved? And yet at the same time, how much more connected they must have been than we are today. How much more unified as a people they were. Now the point here is, I suppose, If we zoom out just a little bit so we don't get distracted by the process or the procedure that is involved with the lot, which can be the drawing of sticks, in which the person that draws the longest or the shortest is chosen for a particular task. And we just reflect on the random nature of assigning tasks in general. What can we say of somebody that is chosen at random? Even that language doesn't sound quite right, because if it is random, then are they chosen? Within this definition, I see similar words as fate, destiny, and fate and destiny are something that have a degree of, they have a quality about them that seems to indicate a determined aspect. That something particular will necessarily happen in the future. Now, of this reflection, I'm not sure what I can say. I could say something of order, I could say something of direction, I could say something of a bit of both, and of God. But I don't know much in that territory. This is not, I don't think, where this proverb is pointing. It is pointing at the reflection of the random. It is asking us to see if we leave something up to that which is outside of the self, what then happens? And that it is because of this selfish desire that the contentions arise in the first place. For if we give up the debate, the anger, that heated argumentation that the contention implies, if we are to sacrifice it to something greater, that seems to us perhaps potentially random as drawing a stick out of somebody's hand. If we are faced truly to accept the responsibility that has been given to us from without that collected sphere, I think it is a testament to a culture or a society that is able to maintain such a structure of determination, to have such a faith. No doubt there are people that are less fit to rule or to be in a particular position than others. But in such situations in which lots are necessary, or lots are seen to be seen as an appropriate way of making a decision, the person that is chosen by that randomness, or that, perhaps we should say, direction, if we see from within him, he is then directed. He is now responsible for something. It is up to him to accept the responsibility that has been bestowed upon him or given to him. Now, if this is to be, it must be a type of governance, perhaps we should say, that is dependent upon a faithful people. Because otherwise a faithful person would not accept that which is given to them from without. Now the second half of this verse, and parteth between the mighty. The lot causes contentions to cease, and parteth between the mighty. Now to part obviously is to separate. It is to leave something behind. And the mighty are the important folk in a society. They are the powerful. They are the resourceful. Perhaps in many cases, they are the diligent. They are the leaders of that society. So even among these, that process of selection by God, the selection by... It's difficult to say if it's the selection by God. It is a randomness. It's difficult to say exactly how God finds man, especially if man's mind is not involved in finding God, but rather it is left to a bundle of sticks, one shorter than another, to this lot. But certainly we can see that there's nothing to argue about, especially if that sacrifice has been made, that the commitment is now to something that is beyond them. A brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city, and their contentions are like the bars of a castle. Okay, so we have an analogy here between some strong relationship between two people, that of a brother, and a strong city, which is something that involves another layer of difficulty, perhaps we can say. A difficulty that involves suffering, it involves death. Or to scale the walls of a strong city, perhaps to break them, to submit their people, requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of moving pieces. And yet, despite this, the brother that is offended is a wall that is much more difficult to scale. And so what is it about that brother, that relationship, and what is it about the nature of offense that leads to such an equivalence? Now we can think of brother both in the literal sense and also the metaphorical sense, the figurative sense, in which there is some unifying element that causes one to be a brother to another, whether they are from the same parents, or they are brothers in a certain type of unifying experience, like in war. Soldiers will often call each other brothers because of the experience of training and also their experience at war. There are times of communal solidarity in which a neighbor might call another neighbor a brother. Much more difficult in the liberal sense. But in the traditional societies that are out there, perhaps, there is more of that communal brotherhood that is felt. A brother could be a close friend. There could be a uniting element there, again, based on life experience. Shared family connections, family bonds. In both cases, in all cases, there is a transcendent peace to that relationship that unites them. And I think that this offense is one that threatens that the top of that pyramid, that uniting element. And I've spoken a lot about the fractal nature of the way that these verses seem to be directing the mind to see the world as. And when I mean fractal, I mean that there are layers of discernment, of interpretation, of reality, much like a Russian doll or particular types of leaves. There is a repeating pattern that continues through the macro, through the large, all the way down through the small. In the case of the Russian doll, the smallest doll within the various layers of dolls is the same in form and appearance as the outermost doll or the largest doll. The only difference is scale. Now, exactly how this fractal is integrated here, we see a small piece of it. We see the brother. We see and understand, by virtue of the word brother, some relationship, a special relationship unified by something that is special in and of itself. And we have the comparison to something that is a bit more macro. It involves many more people than just one person and his brother. And yet, much like a Russian doll, we see it to be quite similar, just different in scale. But it says that it is harder to be one. It's harder to scale that wall. And why would it be difficult? Why would it be more difficult? Why would it be harder? Perhaps it is because the immediacy of that experience, the immediacy of that relationship, of how personal it is to the two parties that are involved. If a general is ordered by a king, or a king takes it upon himself to invade a city, his ideas, his direction is distributed among the people. He has various advisors that give him counsel. Ultimately, of course, he directs. But in the case of offense, the blow, I think, is distributed among the various nodes of that culture, of that society. Now, of course, the king and the council may acutely be aware of the consequences of a failure to take a strong city, or of the strategy, the skill, the military prowess that is required to do so. But still, nonetheless, the experience of the collective and the whole is beyond the experience of the individual. And when I say beyond, it is not beyond perception, it is not beyond understanding, but it is beyond that immediacy, because we as individuals collectively inhabit it, but individually we inhabit our individual experiences. And again, that's not to say that because the collective is at a different level, that we cannot feel at that higher level. But I suppose the point that I'm trying to make and trying to get at here is that there is something about the immediacy of experience, of our experience, and of our relationships that cut quite deeply into the soul, into the spirit, And it is because of the effect that this has on us. The fact that strong bonds and relationships and their various affordances, the effect that the breaking of certain bridges, the destruction of certain roads has on a person is as the opening of the pit of Sheol. It is a darkness, for a brother is a light in that wilderness. And an offense, I think, threatens to dim that light. Now the second half of this verse, and their contentions are like the bars of a castle. Much like the last verse, that seems a reiteration, a confirmation, a solidification of the previous point. That the offense has produced now something that is contentious rather than something that is free-flowing and productive. What has once become a connection of strength and of support has become a connection of chain and restraint, of slavery, of labor. And like many things, it's not entirely a bad thing to go through these difficult periods, because in its through the contentious nature of it, at the other side of it, assuming that it can be repaired, assuming that it can be recovered, I think that there is a strong grace and genesis for something new to be had. But that is a bit outside of the direction of this verse here. A man's belly shall be satisfied with the fruit of his mouth, and with the increase of his lips shall he be filled. Now this verse we have seen at least one time before, and I want to say that we have seen it more than one time before, if not verbatim, then quite close to it. And usually when I see a verse that has been repeated, I take it as an opportunity to not only dive into the verse again, but also to understand that repetition is a way of accentuation. This is an underlining of an important point. A man's belly shall be satisfied with the fruit of his mouth, and with the increase of his lips shall he be filled. So what can I say of such a thing? In the first instance, it appears to me obvious that this verse is full of symbolic language. We have the symbol of the belly, we have the symbol of fruit, we have the mouth, we have the lips. And a pattern that immediately emerges, that stands out to me, is the first part. We have the man's belly shall be satisfied with the fruit of his mouth. That is a link between man's belly and the fruit of his mouth. And then in the second verse, we have the connection by the word and then we have increase. Of his lips shall he be filled. So another analogy, another symbol that is in some relation to the mouth. But the verse in its structure is flipped, because in the second instance we have the symbol of the lips and then the symbol of being filled, whereas in the first part part of the verse we have man's belly, this filling, and then the fruit of the mouth. So what can we say of this belly? Now I'll dive into it as a modern man would. When I think of the belly, I think of the place of digestion. I think of, immediately, I have to admit that I think of the material of the organ that is the stomach. And I think beyond just that material substance, I think of its function. And I think of its relation to the rest of the body. It serves to break down large material into smaller bits so that it is able to be digested by organs further on downstream, like the small intestine and the large intestine. It secretes enzymes and acids to assist in this process. But of course, when we say a man's belly shall be satisfied, in some sense we have this intuitive understanding of what it means to be hungry, and by extension what it means to go without, and the feeling that it provokes, that the body has this inherent pull on the heart, important pull on the heart, because it lets us know, it lets that mind of ours know that in order to survive, the body needs sustenance. The body is linked unchangeably to that mind, however abstract we might try and be, no matter how far the self removes itself from true reality. It is bound to this body. It is bound to the life that it is, that it has been given. Now, when we say a belly is satisfied, I think of the image that a person has consumed food after going through a period of hunger. It doesn't have to be anything particularly drastic or extreme, but just this basic pattern of the satiation of some desire. But it's not just some desire. It's not a superficial desire. It is a desire that is necessary for the maintenance of life and of existence. And so far as we recognize this, I think I can say that the satisfaction of the belly is the appropriate alignment with the fulfillment of the desire of the heart. Now, of course, we can think of this in a perverse manner when the belly is satisfied, perhaps even when it's not hungry, that we consume large amounts of sugary material, and that to a certain degree satisfies us. It removes some external source or some burden that we carry, some anxiety that threatens us in some way. This, of course, is not the type of satisfaction that I mean. A man's belly shall be satisfied with the fruit of his mouth. An interesting transition, because we have an image of the consuming, the entering into, the belly that is something internal that requires something from without. And yet it is satisfied with the fruit of the mouth. And the fruit of the mouth is a production. It is seemingly speech. It is positive speech, whereas positive is oriented in some direction. This direction, what can we say of it? Well, in the basic sense, perhaps we can say that it is on the path, that is on the way up that mountain towards that central peak, towards that divine point, that divine logos. towards transcendence. It is moving up that staircase. It is becoming more informed. It is attempting to integrate information that it has learned. It is putting forth good in the world. It is strengthening relationships. It is developing love, again, as a part of strengthening relationships. The fruit of the mouth. We could think of the fruit as literally a piece of fruit as something that is sweet and pleasurable in a sense. But also a fruit is something that has been brought to bear through some process, through some cyclical process. Imagine a tree that has been brought up from its seed and has now begun to produce fruits. It has completed a sophisticated cycle of existence. And at the layer in which it begins to produce fruit, it provides sustenance to other creatures. It has that relational aspect to other creatures. Now, why am I saying all of this? I'm saying this because this verse makes a lot of very rapid equivalencies, analogies. The belly, of course, is not literal. The fruit of the mouth, of course, is not literal. And even insofar as I interpreted that expression as stemming from the belly, I think literal belly, perhaps I should say, or physical belly, I should say. This may be the road to start the interpretation of the verse, but we should not end there. A man's belly is not primarily restricted to the physical. A man's belly is the essence of wanting, the organ symbolizes quite well of man's need for certain things to be satisfied, to live well. And of course, in the context of the Proverbs, we are not concerned with superficial satisfaction. We are concerned with long-term, meaningful, and sustained satisfaction. And the Proverbs have done us well to prepare us for the dangers and the pitfalls of falling into the self and seeing things only from a selfish perspective. And so with that, we enter this verse with caution. Because as I've mentioned in the physical example of the belly, it is something that receives from without in order to sustain it. But in the case here, we have something that is produced from within that also sustains the desire of that belly, of that, perhaps we could say it's the belly of the soul, the belly of the mind, this belly of this mechanism of our conscious experience. But I think what it is pointing to here is not necessarily selfishness, because again, we have been warned ad nauseum about the dangers of selfishness and of wickedness and of foolishness. But rather, I think there's a discerning point here. That the fruit of one's mouth, in order for it to be fruitful, I think it has to have, and it has to be receptive to, the seed from without. If we imagine our minds and our conscious experience as a fertile landscape, what must be planted within that fertile landscape, or perhaps I should say, for that fertile landscape to be utilized, there must be a planter. And the planter is something that man discovers. And I don't think he discovers it within himself. I think he can do many things by himself to further his understanding by his or from his experiences in life, but he requires those experiences and that information from without in order to appreciate the all of the various seeds that are about us as we interact with people, as we live our lives and experience the world. It is up to us to be discerning and to be receptive as the belly when necessary. Not receptive in the sense that it wishes to satisfy superficial desires, to run from some responsibility, but rather the true desire, that is, something that is required for the sustenance, the sustaining of man, and that in his satisfaction, what is truly being satisfied is the conditions for his meaningful existence. And the fruit of his mouth is something that I am picturing as a tree that has grown through him, like a branch and a root, or perhaps we'll say a branch upon which a fruit can be born. It is sort of in my head, in this image. This branch is jutting from his mouth. At the end of the branch, there are some leaves and perhaps an apple, let's say. And in his mind, at the back of his head, we have this expansive tree, this massive, I'm thinking of an oak tree, of course. The oak tree is not the same as an apple tree, but the point being that there is a massive tree that has sprouted upon the fertile substrate of that conscious mind. And of course, the way that had happened was through the willful care, direction, the fertilization by the individual that allowed that growth to take place. And the fruit is the result of this circular process by which something has come in. All the power and the integration has taken place within the mind. It has gone through that filter. It has been accepted and listened to by the good mind, let's say, by the righteous mind, and it has been brought back down and out through the mouth. That it has, of the material world, it has put back and put forth something that is truly meaningful and productive. And with the increase of his lips shall he be filled. Now I think that this part of the verse is something that what emerges here is something that I had not thought of before. It is an addition. It is a potential correction for somebody that has gone astray. With the increase of his lips shall he be filled. This is a indirect relation to the previous verse. It is saying that upon these lips, if he is to pay attention, if he is to desire the fruitfulness of the mouth, and by extension, the sophisticated manipulation that the lips provide us, and how it shapes the sound of our language. If we are, again, to pay attention, if we are to desire and accept the seed to be planted within our fertile substrate, fertile conscious mind, with the acceptance of that, and by extension that increase and that meaningful speech, that meaningful productive behavior, he shall be filled, that belly will be filled. he, in a certain sense, has found new life. He has sustained a certain type of life. Again, a meaningful life. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they who love it shall eat the fruit thereof. Another interesting verse that applies similar imagery. I think we've also seen this verse before. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit of it. Now, the fruit of the mouth, the fruit of the lips, the fruit of the tongue, I have to wonder what the difference is in the symbolism between the mouth, the lips, and the tongue. How sophisticated this representation is. Now, the tongue, I think, specifically manipulation. And not necessarily manipulation in the negative sense, for I can grab an object that's in front of me and I can manipulate it, I can handle it, I can control it, I can influence it in some way. Now, of course, all of these things can have a positive and a negative. And so I see death and life are in the power of this manipulation. Now again, here, a verse that cuts quite deep. And without the proper context of the book of Proverbs, that with all of its incessant warnings about the dangers of the self, I think that this verse can fall into evil hands. Now, what can we say of the power of the tongue if we are not secured against the dangers of self-centeredness and of the primary value being placed, that locus of value placed within that center of the self, without any interaction or influence by the outside? Death and life are in the power of the tongue. In what way, we might ask? We have the ending, we have the beginning. In some sense, we can consider death the ending. We can consider it to be the ending of the life, the cessation of certain processes, of metabolic processes, of physical processes, the end of one's conscious experience, the end of the self. Life, we can consider individual identity. We can think of a beginning. We could think of some process that is currently occurring. And both within these 2 points in that cycle, the power of the tongue operates, and it can influence both. Now, my morbid mind wants to go directly towards the manipulation of the tongue that leads one to on the path of death. But I think that there is a more productive way to use this verse to interpret the words here. Let's consider our fractals, our repeating patterns that repeat and are the same as they move out or move back in. What changes is the scale. And perhaps we can also say embeddedness matters here as well. We can have different fractals perhaps interacting with one another to produce quite intricate and detailed patterns. Now I should mention, for the sake of honesty, that today is a new day. Not very often do I cut off a thought as I've had it. Usually I like to complete it so I don't have to retrace my steps. Invariably, when it does happen, I tell myself at the time of stopping that I will pick this up. I'll remember where I was exactly, and I'll be able to, perhaps it's out of fatigue at that point, and I'll tell myself, come back when you have a fresher mind. Perhaps you'd be able to follow the trail a bit more diligently, perhaps with a greater degree of discernment. And then there are some times, it hasn't happened very often, only a handful of times, but it seems what has happened at this point is a question whether or not the introduction of the fractals here is a good idea. Not necessarily because it's unrelated to the conversation, but because I'm not entirely sure how to make an appropriate relationship between that fractal structure and the verse. So I think what I ought to do at this point is to talk a little bit more about the word power. And if it does come to pass that there is some relationship that I can draw to our fractals or our Russian dolls, then I will do so. Now, what can be said of this word power? Now, I've looked up a little bit of its meaning, of its etymology. And what I have here in front of me is something that is boiled down through old French, in turn coming from Latin, as many things do. And there is a meaning that means to be able. This is one conception of power, of course. Like many words, there are more than one meaning. But I think we should keep in mind this to be able, this ability. Of course, power also has, within its form, within its structure, we can say strength, we can say authority, control, influence, energy. A basic Google definition here, the first definition: the ability to do something or act in a particular way, especially as a faculty or quality. So there again we have ability, to be able. The capacity, this is another definition, the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. Again, the ability. Now, it seems like the second definition here is more of a specifically directed definition from the first, whereas the first is more general, the ability to do something or act in a particular way. And the second is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others. Sort of a pessimistic view of power. And there are various sub-definitions under that second one: political or social authority or control, especially that by government; a right or authority that is given or delegated to a person or body; the military strength of a state or country, especially one viewed in terms of its international influence and military strength; a person or organization that is strong or influential within a particular context; a supernatural being, deity, or force. So, we start from this ability, and as we have expanded down through the definitions, we have, on one hand, we've stuck with the definition of it's the ability or capacity to be able to do something. And then we also added different directions through which this ability can manifest, which we might imagine as these different horizontal directions. But there's also the vertical dimensions. And what is the vertical? Well, the vertical implies something that is beyond human, the man. And we talked of the nation, we talked of the state, of the military as an institution, of a corporate body, of the individual, of course, too, and also of a deity, of a supernatural being. And that sort of represents what I'm considering here as a vertical representation. If we had to imagine a three-dimensional shape to this word, and if we sort of imagined it like a sphere, it has its horizontal dimensions to it and its vertical dimension. Upon each vertical dimension, if we take the state or if we take the individual, we can spread out in that horizontal direction and describe various things that the state or an individual is able to do, that has the ability to do. Now, there's another word that was mentioned here, and I think at times these two words can be sort of antagonistic to each other, but also they can be used sort of interchangeably as synonyms, and that is authority, power and authority. Now, authority, I think more of right, where power is more fundamental, perhaps. It is pure ability. Now, to exercise authority, of course, power must be involved there. There must be the ability to exercise that authority. And so, in a certain sense, the words share space within each other. But then as we move out a little bit, authority begins to differ from power, and perhaps we ought not to go down into that hole, that rabbit hole. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Now, there are more definitions of power, but I don't think I'll go into those for now. But rather, I would like to talk about the word ability. Now, I see two definitions in front of me here. The first is possession of the means or skill to do something. The second, talent, skill, or proficiency in a particular area. Now, in some sense, from the human perspective, to do is almost as fundamental as to be. Now, of their relationship, we need not get into right now, but just to think about to do. Now, of course, in this definition, ability wound up in it is skill or possession of some means. Now, at some level, all of us have the means to do something. At the most fundamental, perhaps, we have the means to do life, to exist, to think. To do these things are not all that special in our eyes, but I think that they are fundamental. They're quite interesting to reflect on. And I think about when we are thinking about words, it's useful to get rid of some of the fluff that is used in defining these words. If we want to find the fundament, if we want to find the root of these words, skill really doesn't offer us anything here, because we can imagine a form of ability that extends beyond one's skill that's essentially innate to all people. And perhaps this is where the fractal conversation comes in. And why do I say that? Because at the fundamental level, I think we can appreciate a certain pattern. This is to do. To possess, to have the ability is an interesting expression as well. That there is some possession that's innate to man's being, that he is able to do something. Now, how does this relate to fractals? Well, it has to, at some level, I think, since we are at the fundament now, or since we're pretty close to some fundamental consideration of some definition, when we think of speech, when I'm speaking into this microphone. I don't think there's going to be, first of all, no one's probably going to listen to this, but second of all, I don't think anybody that listens to this is thinking or fearing for their death, nor considering life. But perhaps, if I'm able to manipulate my words in such a way, what I have the ability to do through the expression of my speech is to influence, it is to direct, but also to produce. And I would hope that, at least from a sort of a selfish standpoint, that when I am producing, I am speaking into the microphone about some proverb or reading a book that I find particularly meaningful to me, that what I am setting in motion is a reflection, it is a process, it is a discipline by which I can expand my appreciation for life, expand my ability perhaps to do or to think. To do thinking, perhaps I should say. But the fractals come into this at some point, because how exactly is the pattern of my speech, the meaning of my words that I put together, how is this, or how can this be put together in such a way to influence words that are so expansive as death and life? These words in and of themselves, I think we can imagine another sphere, both with a horizontal and vertical dimension, and we can go to town on those two words for a long time. Probably much longer than we can with the word power. But just so that we are not left lonely in this perceptual landscape, I'll throw out a couple words, that of ending, that of beginning, that of darkness, that of luminosity, that of sleepfulness, or sleep, and that of wakefulness. These words, I think, we can find ourselves using in relation to death and life. And through these words, through these connections, I think it's much easier to see exactly how the power of the tongue can influence these things, seemingly immovable, but at another time quite obvious how it's possible to do such a thing. We can imagine countless scenarios in which people throughout the ages have had the ability or have been in a position of authority to enact certain actions that have led to the death of people. There have been behaviors, people have taken it upon themselves to do something, or take it upon themselves to recognize the ability to save the life of another, or to make the commitment to have children, to perpetuate life. And I think it might be useful here to reflect on the tongue as this manipulative organ that allows speech to exit the confines of the perceptual mind, of the directed mind, this thing that is experiencing reality, and then push it out forth into the world so that it could bounce off the nodes of the other creatures that can perceive it, that can understand it. And I think that within the tongue we have both of the moving out from, but also the conceptualization within the mind of this ability of some action or behavior that one wants to initiate or to perpetuate into the world. You know, sometimes given our limitation as human beings, I think it's difficult to come to an understanding of that transcendence, of that divine, or to understand how one's behavior has an effect on anything other than itself. How to escape the selfish prison is not an easy task, especially for the modern man, given all of his liberties and his responsibilities. But perhaps even if I don't reach a definitive conclusion on this verse, I think that we ought to find ourselves in a place of caution, so that we may not exercise a misdirection of our tongue such that it disturbs something fundamental. It has a cause that perhaps cannot be undone. I'm old enough now to have seen how particular events can unfold throughout the years, and how they may not really come to any sort of recognizable thing until many years have passed, until many mistakes have been made. The converse surely is true of wise decision-making, of disciplined behavior. But given my limited experience and my grasping into that darkness, I think there is a lot that man can do with the mind that he has. And I don't necessarily just mean the cities that he is able to construct, but the way that he is able to be, the things he is able to do. They that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. They that love the power of the tongue shall eat the fruit thereof. Now, if you'll grant me one axiom, that we live upon a fertile landscape of perception, and that our minds are just one perception, or one perspective, I should say. One perspective by which that fertile perceptual landscape is afforded. It is afforded by I hesitate to say mind or consciousness, but I'm not really sure how to describe it. Some perception that is beyond the singular, beyond the little ants that we seem to be upon this landscape. Similar, perhaps, to a singular tree in a forest. If we found ourselves in the middle of a vast forest, perhaps in up in Canada somewhere, or somewhere in Maine, I'm thinking. That vast fertile landscape by which the trees have grown, it seems inconsequential if we consider a singular tree within that landscape, and we ourselves feel insignificant. Now, the point here is not insignificance, it's rather the map that I'm attempting to outline, and that axiom of our seed-like nature upon on that substrate, that conscious substrate. Now, given that all that I've said about my inability to see how particular actions might play out in the future, and also admitting that certain things that have happened in the past are much like seeds that have been planted, and it's not until many years have passed that we can really appreciate the tree or the meaningful or perhaps harmful object's not the right word, meaningful form, I guess I could say, for the lack of a better term, that has emerged in our own perceptual landscape. If we zoom out and consider ourselves as seeds within that broader landscape, in a broader mind, I think that it really makes us consider our own actions, our own behaviors. And even if we can't appreciate what it means to be a part of that thing, at least not directly, as we can feel our own experience, I think our own experience, our own perspective, is the thing that we have to rely on that allows us to empathize, not only with other people, obviously, but also with that transcendence, the fundamental axiom that I had asked for an admission. And that certainly puts in perspective the power of our tongue, but also the judgment of our behavior. Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing, and obtain favor of the Lord. Now this verse, I'll have to admit, at the outset is difficult for me to understand. Not because I don't believe it, but because I think that the road for me to understand it is long. And so the question is, well, why do I consider the road to understanding this verse to be long? Well, I think there are many different sources, many different books, earlier books from that of the Proverbs, that are necessary here. My mind goes to a few different places, 3 routes. My mind considers the books of law, which I probably won't get into too much here. But I mention the books of law because within those books there are explicit detailings, I guess I can say, of how a man should orient himself into society, to how he should structure his relationships, and that also has to do with his relationship to his spouse. And of course in the 10 Commandments it touches on this sanctuary that is provided by marriage, that institution, that sacred institution. My mind goes to Genesis because I think of the divine feminine, which of course is a fundamental aspect in Genesis. And my mind also goes to something that we've been talking about already, which might be our entry point into understanding this verse, which is that of the fractals. The fractals, of course, is intimately related to the divine feminine. If we can understand, or if we can at least conceptualize, put forth some items, some clay that has yet to be molded. So if we can put those forth in relation to the divine feminine, and at that level give ourselves an illustration of what that is, we can walk ourselves back all the way down into the soul, into the heart. Of course, I am talking as a man. Perhaps an understanding of the divine masculine is also appropriate here. So I can understand exactly how this relationship ought to be, what the fundamentals of it are, and why this would be pleasing to that divine landscape. So of the divine feminine, now I'll have to perhaps apologize because this is going to be rather simple. But as we go forward, maybe we can unpack some of this in greater detail. But of the divine feminine, I think this can be associated with receptivity, creativity, compassion, intuition, healing. If we think about some fundamental things related to the female, the human female, or perhaps just female in general, in nature, this receptive component is very important. That the female of the species receives the seed of the male. She is responsible for that nurturing and growth of the child. And her responsibility, I think we can, my mind is drawn from a few different places here. We can think of, perhaps it's possible to think of the feminine in relation to a particular period, a period before the Industrial Revolution and a period after scientific advancements, a period before strong cultural institutions, a period after. It's hard to exactly say where I should look at it, but perhaps finding differences within these periods is a superficial distinction. We ought not let time be a limiting factor here. But insofar as that thought should be expressed, since I mentioned it, I'll say that I think the woman in 2023 has a much different experience of motherhood, at least in the United States, than a woman in 500 BC. Now, there are certain fundamentals to the experience of motherhood and of being female that are, of course, always the same, and this is sort of what I was talking about. These sort of things, these principles transcend time. This would be the type of stuff that we would expect to see within that conception of the divine feminine. However, as Herodotus quotes, that custom is the king of all men, sometimes I think custom can be this polluting force just as much as the perceiving mind can be. That is, its limited interface with reality. I often think of our cultural landscape and how this is sort of another layer of understanding upon the perceptual creature that we are, that within our culture there's all sorts of preconceived notions, there are expected behaviors and so forth. We can outline many different things that are unique to a culture, or things that make a culture, or something that makes a custom. But just like the limited perceptual landscape that is our minds, I think that custom also has this unfortunate side to it. Although, like our perceptual mind, it's beautiful in the experience that we have and the opportunity that we are given, but unfortunate in the sense that it is so limited to the vastness of reality and the extent of our understanding. And the last thing that I think that I would say about this culture custom situation here is that within this deception that I'm now trying to wrestle with, I find myself thinking about the periods. I find myself using time as a variable because of the seemingly transitory nature of the culture today versus a culture separate to today, and how the experience of the woman in our society has changed. But again, to be caught up in such a thing, I think, might be a waste of time. But rather, I ought to consider, and I ought to reflect and spend my attention on those things that are constant. And I think that I mentioned a few of those already. So, what is that? What does all that mean? Well, I think it means that we are going to avoid the topics of feminism. I think we are going to avoid what some may call like a misogyny, a cultural misogyny, or different periods that have different experiences wound up in them. And we can do that ad nauseum and not get anywhere. Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing. So a wife is a particular thing. It's not just whoso findeth a female. It is whoso findeth a wife. And I think by extension, we could also think of this verse, whoso findeth a husband. But whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing. So what is a wife? A wife is something that extends beyond the female, beyond just the feminine. It is a feminine that is wound up within something. It is within this basket, this institutional basket that is marriage, perhaps we can say. But what is in this basket? If she finds herself in there, what else is in that basket? Well, it involves, just like a woven basket, perhaps we can say, of the basket, the wife is part of the fibers. She articulates with the community, she articulates with the family, she articulates with the man that she is going to be married to, or that she is married to. She articulates to the city that she lives in, again, the community, the broader nation or state. She articulates with the divine, not only the source, that divine unity, but also that feminine spirit she articulates with. She is tempered by the masculine spirit, but she is also a gift giver of her own innate being. And I think that within this basket that is woven up of all of these different things, that when marriage brings or connects together these two people, that connect the families together, that in some sense adds another layer of interwovenness to the community, and it gives it a degree of solidity, of stability, of structure. Within this basket, I think we could say that life has the possibility of being put forth and produced. Of course, life can be produced outside of the institution of marriage, but the way that it is put forth, the way that it is proliferated, is much reduced. It's reduced if it's not properly, like I said, interwoven. And it is the way that the fibers are interwoven that give it its strength, much like the fibers of a ligament or a tendon or a muscle. Now, there's something important here that I want to bring up or put forward, and that has to do with the conception of the feminine in the Proverbs. From what I remember, I think there are a few different instances in which we encountered the feminine. We encountered a very old principality of the female that is bound up within this conception of wisdom. We also have, like in many things with the Proverbs, the other side of the coin that is of this destructive type. In my mind, I picture sort of a witch, but again, from what I remember in the Proverbs here, perhaps I can go to it. It's early on in the Proverbs, or the early chapters. So chapter 5, for the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell. So there's one conception there. and I'd like to find the other. And there's a few places for which the feminine is brought up in relation to wisdom. But in chapter 9, verse 1, wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out her 7 pillars. She has killed her beasts. She has mingled her wine. She has also furnished her table. She has sent forth her maidens. She cries upon the highest place of the city. Chapter 8 is essentially one giant piece of this feminine wisdom crying out, speaking its truth. The first verse, "Doeth not wisdom cry, and understanding put forth her voice? She stands in the top of high places, by the way and the places of the paths. She cries at the gates, at the entry of the city, and at the coming in at the doors. Unto you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of man. And it continues from there, and it's really a pretty exploration into this wisdom, into this principality. But the main point here is that this principality is referred to as the feminine, which is quite interesting. Now, when I say principality, I mean this general sphere of something that is inhabited by some spirit. Now, I don't really want to get into a theological type of explanation here. It's going to get us too far away from the verse. But I think it's important to understand that something as highly sought after as wisdom is given this feminine attribute. Another thing that I think we should orient ourselves toward is that we have two fundamentals here in the verse. Again, the wife, that is the feminine that is wound up within the institution of marriage to man, and all the stuff that I just described. And the fundamental component, which I've also begun to talk about, this fundamental female component. And so it's obvious that this verse is addressed to a man, because a woman would not be finding a wife. It just wouldn't make much sense to do so. So why would we consider this to be a good thing? Well, we've mentioned already the integration into family, community, and the various levels they're in. We've talked about stability and structure. We've talked about the orientation of the fibers of those bundles that make that community stronger, that give it strength. But there's something here of this good that I really want to find something within this divine feminine that I can chew on, that I can think about in the future. It's all well and good, I think, to think about the benefits of this institution of marriage and how it provides structure to society. But it's not quite enough to understand how fundamental and why it is so that this integration between a man and a woman is so, like I said, so fundamental. Again, fundamental outside of the things that we've already described. Now, the last thing that I would say before I make this plunge, so to speak, into my attempt to find something, I don't want to use the word fundamental again, and I don't want to use something superficial as something that satiates, something that satisfies. But something that I can come back to, something that I can rely on. Before we attempt to find something of that sort, I would like to give humility its proper due and its recognition here. as it is something that, or perhaps I should say that I recognize that there is much beyond myself. I recognize that although I may desire the fundamental, my perception, my understanding is inherently limited, and although that should not persuade me from trying to determine the truth, it does, and it should provide me with perspective that even if I may fail, that it does not mean that there is not something fundamental out there upon which I can orient myself, nor does it mean, perhaps in the case of my success, that I do find something that I can orient myself around, that I should not be, and I should not attribute excess attention where it is not worth the effort. Well, not worth the effort, not worth the attention, I guess, in the sense that my pillars that are determined, discovered through deliberation, through discernment, they ought not to become an idol. And I think that there is a risk in that sort of thing, especially with these types of matters. And I think that is avoided by always returning to that divine peak, that divine logos, the top of that mountain. That is beyond me, something that I will never be able to perceive, but that I believe in firmly, because without that belief, there would be no intelligibility to this world. There would be no order upon which I could find myself an agent. There would be no fertile soil through which I could sprout my branches and grow and ascend and transcend. So with that, let's make a plunge. So I found myself into a bit of the unknown here. I've wandered into the woods. It's at night. Today it rained a lot, so within this woods it's humid. You know, it's October. It's October 13th. Friday the 13th. Perhaps there's a bit of a spooky vibe to my exploration. But I'm looking for this feminine. And I ask myself as I'm in this dark, damp woods, where am I going to find the feminine in here? What does it look like? If I found it, would I know? What of this feminine do you understand? You're lucky enough to have experienced a love that is from that divine place. And what does that say to you? How does it call you? How does it influence your steps to find it? Well, I see, partly through this lens of custom and culture, that the color red and the symbol of the heart is something that of love. And I see this image floating around my conscious perception. It's a bit fuzzy. It's encapsulated in something. This red heart, I suppose we can call it. A bit fuzzy, pixelated maybe. But it seems that it is being given to me within this package. Perhaps behind the package is the purer form. That is why it is fuzzy. That is why it is not immediately resolute. But I've been given this thing by the divine feminine. I haven't seen her, or perhaps I have. It's hard to say. At this moment, all I can see is what has been given to me. What has been given to me is love. But certainly love can be given to me by a man. And so what is this then? Through what filter has the love passed that it reaches me? Like a long road, or a winding cavern through which a river has carved out its own path. I see this light that has come from its place of being, its place of origin, its genesis. It has traveled through certain things. Filter is a good example. Not one, but a few, to get to me. And one of which I think is that divine feminine. Now, what do I mean by that? And by extension, how does that change the nature of this love? It's difficult to say. But of compassion, of wisdom, of that half of Adam that is part of the whole that represents man. Perhaps we can boil it down to some material explanation. And by that, I don't necessarily mean to detract or to devalue, but rather, perhaps there is something about, at least within the separation of man as a one entity, let's say, male and female, that the female is directed in a particular way. Of course, her makeup can be studied, her hormones, her form, and all this sort of thing, just as man can. I don't think that that's necessarily, it can be useful. It can give us a picture. But of the form, it would take a little bit more to describe. And our experiences certainly help us in this domain. And of course, I think we also have to separate out the immense variability that can accompany the female, the feminine. And I think most of this variability has to do with the limitations of the human being, rather than the divine form of the female, which is perfect in its character. It's a platonic, perhaps we can, in platonic form, I guess we can conceptualize it in this way, that it is above any individual woman, human being, but through her, unlike that of man, it is a particular experience of consciousness, a particular filter through which the light of intelligibility is shown. So perhaps I should say that, or perhaps I should consider, again, the verse saying, "Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing, and obtaineth favor of the Lord." Now we've gone down a ways into a particular depth. In some sense not deep enough, in some sense sufficiently deep for this verse. I think that I can say here that at the very least, even if it seems like we haven't touched the surface of that divine feminine, which I think we have penetrated to a degree, but we have illustrated the landscape, which I think is primarily important here. In future considerations, I think it would be prudent to maybe explore the divine feminine a little bit more. But for now, we have thought of this wife as an extension of something of that divine form, which in and of itself is an extension of that perceptual landscape, the the magnificent emanation from that central sphere that seems to permeate all reality, all of this substrate that is possible for experience, for conscious awareness, for mapping by conscious beings, for understanding. And it is through our union with the other half of that creates Adam, that creates capital M, man. That it is two parts of a whole, that we have our own experiences, but the experience of man includes that of the divine feminine and of the divine masculine. And if oriented properly, the human form as they inhabit these inhabit these forms, and as they interweave together, both at the level of that interpersonal relationship, that marriage between the two individuals, but again, through the families, through the culture, through the town, through the city, whatever, all the way up. We find ourselves producing this meshwork of human civilization that allows this light from beyond to shine through and find us. And find us in such a way that we are able to be receptive and listen to it. That we are able to be strong and resolute in the face of hardship, difficulty. And it's strange, to think of our experience. Why does this light even move away from the source? What is the point of it? I'm hoping we get to some of these answers, or at least some prompting to reflect on some potential answers here, because they are difficult questions. Now, when we get to the book of Ecclesiastes, I think we will encounter a fair number of these questions. So again, in closing of this verse, we have two more after this verse in chapter 18, but in the closing of this verse, of verse 22, we obtain favor in the Lord through finding a wife or through marriage, because we are unifying and we are strengthening, we are interweaving, we are essentially producing reality. We are coming back into, or maybe that's not the right way to put it, but we are illuminating that landscape. That landscape of perception and of understanding. We are transcending. The poor uses entreaties, but the rich answereth roughly. So I think it's fair to say by the context of this verse that when we see the words poor and rich, we are talking about a few things. We're talking about perhaps a material situation, but we're also talking about a social situation or circumstance. And I've talked a fair deal in this series about the word poor and the word rich and how this can extend in a few different directions, especially without the context to restrain the word. But here, unlike some of the other examples that we've seen in the Proverbs, poor and rich are relatively directed and defined. And I think for the purposes of interpretation, what seems to be useful here is social class or social standing. Now the poor uses entreaties. Now that word entreaty is packed with meaning. Now, on the surface, entreaty is an earnest or humble request. Now, humility, the beginning, the origin of all great virtues, it begins from a place of openness, perhaps, a degree of self-sacrifice, the desire to know, the willingness to listen. Of earnest, we can say it is something resulting from or showing sincere and intense conviction. Of conviction, we think of something that is firmly held, a belief that is firmly held. And it's an interesting quality of the poor in this situation, that they are the type of people that find themselves grasping so tightly onto things, because in their state of deprivation, they lack those things that can pervert their attention, those riches that they could hang on to, but are rather loose items in the grand scheme of things. They blow freely in the wind of the superrelativism that I've discussed often. I think the material wealth of this kind finds itself in this relativism. It is not grounded. It is not transcendent. It's not unifying. It's just something that distracts, something that can provide, certainly, provide opportunity for many great things if one is to take it. But there is a certain trend among the poor that seem to have this hearty, faithful attitude about them. Now the second half of the verse, but the rich answer roughly. And we have to ask, well, who are they answering? Well, it's likely that they're answering the entreaties of the poor. Now, we don't know exactly what the poor are making this earnest request of the rich for. Surely in every society and every culture, the differences, the levels between different social classes have always existed. And the relationship between these different social classes probably has been no less tenuous. But as I think about this verse, I think of periods of extreme difference, of massive wealth gaps between those who have and those who have not, assuming that they are not slaves, but perhaps it's difficult to tell at a certain point. Perhaps once man finds himself in a state of slavery relative to his neighbor, then he begins his entreaty. Or perhaps he begins the entreaty at a place where he ought not to make it. But then we can argue, well, is it really an entreaty? Is it really an earnest or humble request? Perhaps it is. Difficult to say, but this roughness in response to an entreaty, we have to ask ourselves why this might be the case. How is it that wealth pollutes the mind such that it does not take into account the condition, the state of deprivation of a neighbor? In the modern context, I think of what is required of people to acquire great wealth. But it's not just that. It is the decision to submit oneself to some body that is well beneath the divine realm. It is submitting it to man. It is an act of enslavement on the part of the modern-day rich. And I think of our managerial class. I think, along with various other occupations or sectors of the economy, I think it's difficult to find a better picture of a modern-day slave than the managerial class. Free to a certain degree, but altogether slaves to large corporate bodies of interests that are well beyond their own. They care not for that. All they care about is their remuneration, their salary. And I think among these people, among this class, it makes them a bit rough. It makes them a bit harsh. It makes them a bit simple. Of course, not all of them are this way, but they become simple. They become adolescent. They become adolescent in the nature of the heart and the understanding of his experience in the world. Now, I should make a distinction here. I'm not against somebody that is managing a group of people. My main argument is against the way in which the modern man has found himself into positions of leadership and management. That the chain is unholy. In many cases, certainly not in all, but this is the difficulty with our age. A man that has friends must shew himself friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. This is a rather strange verse. This is not a pattern that we see very often. We've seen a couple verses, I think, related to friendship and brotherhood, but this is something that is a bit out of the ordinary for the Proverbs. So a man that has friends must show himself friendly. I'm not sure what direction I should make of this pointing. I'm not sure what direction this proverb is asking me to move in, what backdrop it's asking me to paint against the blank canvas. So in the first instance, we have a man that has friends. It seems like it implies he has many friends. And because he has many friends, there is this attachment, there is a requirement, there is a precondition that he must show himself friendly. It's an interesting use of language. So he must show himself friendly. If he did not show himself friendly, perhaps he would ruin his relationships. But what of it? Is it suggesting some superficial relation, that these friends are not really all that close? And that within this must there is some deceptive behavior, there is some falsehood, there is some antagonism. It's not it's an unnatural behavior. Well, perhaps that is a pessimistic approach. We can also say a man that has friends must show himself friendly, because this is what he ought to do if he has friends. He must reciprocate. Otherwise, the friendships will not maintain. Their bonds will dissolve. They will become brittle and break. And that within this must, it is rather not it can be seen in this context not as something unnatural, but rather something that is perfectly natural. But within this nature, it is called beyond himself. That call beyond himself to be more to his friends, to cherish them. And there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. Another interesting way to describe a relationship, something that's closer than a brother, is to imply some relationship that is very, very intimate, very strong bonds. For a brother is part of this meshwork that I mentioned earlier in relation to the verse on marriage. To be and to have a bond that is stronger than this, I find this an interesting conception, where this meshwork would be even stronger in this case. That this friend is now part of a family. It is something that is integrated in something that was otherwise solidified into community, that's bound families together through marriage and through blood relations. I'm not too sure if there's much to say other than that there are many ways in which we can interweave with one another such that we can create strong bonds and strong relations, strong communities, and expand our families. Now, in closing, I'd like to, I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but I've always found language a frustrating thing. It's an imperfect thing. It's an imperfect creation. It's something that we must use to connect ourselves, to expand our thinking. I can't imagine what my mind would be like without language, what that inner voice would be. And when it comes to conveying information, how difficult it is to determine what one wants to say and one wants to convey. I think oftentimes, speaking for myself, perhaps I don't even understand what I want to convey. The words just come out. And I think to a fault this occurs. And I think it's a testament to the prudence of an individual to be able to measure themselves with proper language, to say what they mean, to temper their feelings in their heart, and to give it a proper voice. And when we expand this to written language, and the understanding, perhaps, of one person that says something into the ear of another, and the understanding of that, misinterpretation, I think, is a dreadful thing. We can miss such beauty and wonder, but also we can miss the truth or the meaning that one wishes to convey. Now, this last verse in chapter 18, chapter 24, or verse 24, is such a situation. I find myself having difficulty understanding exactly what the first part of that verse means. I started negative, I ended positive. The second half of the verse is more straightforward than the first half. But it makes me wonder, through the multiple translations of the Bible, how this can influence my thinking. For this is the King James Version. A man that has friends must show himself friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. But if I were to read the English Standard Version, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. If I read the New Living Translation, there are friends who destroy each other, but a real friend sticks closer than a brother. If I read the American Standard Version, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. And most of those translations are pretty constant. But what comes to my understanding is that my first interpretation was the correct one. And I suppose that frustration is from that translation. It is what is lost in the meaning of one person trying to understand what somebody else meant. And given the scale of this translation, one has to wonder. Certainly, generally, in this instance, the interpretation got through. But nonetheless, one has to wonder. And it becomes all that more pertinent, I think, from an individual's point of view, to be discerning about the language that they use. So this is the end of chapter 28. And I will continue next time with chapter 19.